So, good afternoon. This is Julia Graham. I'm the Deputy CEO at AIRMIC, and I would like to welcome you to our latest webinar, which focuses on the Automated and Electric Vehicles Act 2018. Now, the reason we're running this webinar is that the UK is rather ahead of the game on this particular legislation, and we've been absolutely thrilled to bring together 3 experts in this area who are going to share their respective views on this subject. Please do join in, but the 3 speakers I just want to introduce briefly are Dr Matthew Channon, who's a lecturer in law at the University of Exeter. We then will move on to Tony Dempster, who's a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills. And last but by no means least is David Williams, who's technical director at AXA Insurance. Just to remind you, you will have an opportunity to ask questions, and that will work by following the process which is on the screen now about how you ask questions during the webinar. Don't be shy. We've got excellent people here with us who are willing to take your questions. If you pose them during the webinar, then generally I will ask those questions of the speaker that you're aiming them towards. So please do speak up and email those questions to me, and we will do our best to answer them as we go through the webinar. So we're going to take about half an hour to do this webinar. So we'll give each of our 3 panel experts the opportunity to speak about their specific subject on the overall topic of the webinar. And over to you, Matt, as the first speaker.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Julia. So, yeah, I'm Dr Matthew Channon. I'm a lecturer in law at the University of Exeter. And I'm currently co-authoring a book called The Law and Driverless Cars, which is going to be out in probably around April next year, 2019. So, in this presentation I'm doing today, I'm looking mainly at the previous regime, because obviously now the Automated and Electric Vehicles Bill, is what we used to call it, is now an act. It's quite difficult to get used to be honest, because I'm always used to calling it the bill rather than the act. But I'm now looking at the previous regime, which was pre-act, which is the compulsory third-party motor insurance. Which is compulsory at the moment now for not just conventional vehicles, but also automated vehicles. But pre-act, it was only compulsory for conventional motor vehicles. It covered the use of a vehicle, and it covered accidents caused by or arising out of use of a vehicle. Use of a vehicle was a criminal offence without insurance under Section 143 of the Road Traffic Act, as well as causing and or permitting use of a motor vehicle. The insurer under Section 151 had a duty to compensate third-party victims, and that was the insurer of the driver who was at fault. So if someone ran someone else over, then the insurer, the person who ran them over, would under a duty to compensate. And where the vehicle was uninsured or untraced, the Motor Insurers Bureau, which is a bureau consisting of every motor insurer in the UK, would then compensate under their agreement. If we go on to the next slide, there were 2 major incompatibilities between the Road Traffic Act and automated vehicles. First and foremost, insurance was only required for a person's use of a vehicle, not for the product itself. So what would happen is, if, for example, my vehicle crashed, it was obviously my insurer would compensate. Now, if there was a fault with the vehicle itself, i.e., it was a faulty product, then still anyone could still claim from a manufacturer, but the manufacturer did not require insurance. So under the Road Traffic Act, insurance was only required really for the use of a vehicle, not for the vehicle driving itself. And obviously, when we look at later stages of automation, i.e. levels 4 and 5, if you look at the Society of Automotive Engineers, they have these levels 1 to 6, well, 0 to 5, sorry. And level 5 is looking at the most the highest automation, and level 4, again, which is very highly automated. The very highly automated vehicles, they require no human input in terms of when they're driving. So the responsibility shifts from the driver to the vehicle itself. And there was no need for insurance under the Road Traffic Act. Also, insurance would never cover for damage caused to the person who was actually driving the at-fault vehicle. If someone drove into me, that's fine, I could claim off their insurer. But if I drove into someone myself and I was at fault, then the answer is, well, I wouldn't get any compensation because it's my fault. We have a fault-based system. So there was no cover there. Now, obviously, when you look at automated vehicles, there's no longer going to be anyone actually in charge of the vehicle. So that person who is even sat maybe in the driver's seat, they still would not be. They would want compensation because they were not at fault. But the Road Traffic Act didn't give them that. We go on to the next slide. So we had the consultation, July 2016, and the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles proposed a product liability insurance. So this approach basically meant that there'd most likely be 2 separate policies of insurance, one covering the product, one covering the driver. And then the insurers would basically fight it out between who would be compensated. The problem is with product liability is that it's not compulsory. It has a 10-year limit. There is lots of defences that can be used, and therefore it's not compatible with the protectionist stance of motor insurance. The whole point of motor insurance is to compensate victims. Also, product liability, it would have caused quite a lot of disputes, and it wasn't a particularly good system. So after the consultation, with it seems quite a lot of insurance input, the government rejected product liability and went for a single insurance approach, basically one insurance policy covering both the driver and the vehicle in one insurance policy. And then, but anyway, that'll be talked about later by Tony. So that was a consultation. If we go on to the next slide. So then we had, at the beginning, there was something called the Modern Transport Bill. That was the first name of what it was going to be called. Then it went on to the Vehicle Technology and Aviation Bill, which was introduced in by the Department for Transport early 2017. Then we had the Parliament being dissolved. So then we had a general election, and that bill then obviously then was dissolved. They had to then introduce another bill coming up to the end of last year. There was a lot of consultation on this bill through the House of Commons and House of Lords. And now, in the last month or so, we've just had the introduction of the automated and electric vehicles. So one thing I would note is that this seminar here, we're talking about the automated part of the Automated Electric Vehicles Act. The electric part is something which is very separate. And something that I know the government is really keen on, but it's not something that has got much relation to automated vehicles, apart from the fact that they will be electric. And that's that from me, really.
Matt, it's Julia here. I want to ask one question on this that's cropped up, and that is, the first act actually had vehicle and aviation, and the final act has got automated and electric vehicles. What's happened to the aviation bit?
I actually don't know. I mean, the way I saw the Vehicle Technology and Aviation Bill, it kind of put 2 very, very distinct things in it. It had vehicle technology and aviation in 2 very separate things in one bill. It seems like a lot of the time, motor insurance is often bolted on to things in that act. For example, the Road Traffic Act has got only a few provisions on insurance, and then tons of other things on the use of a vehicle while drunk, etc., etc. So it seems like, again, they tried to bolt on a little bit the insurance provisions to something else. Well, this time it's actually insurance and electric. It kind of works together a bit better.
Well, that's okay. We're going to park that question because I think it's something David Williams might be able to pick up when we come on to David. Okay, Matt, thank you very much indeed for covering that. We're now going to pass on to Tony Dempster, partner at Herbert Smith Freehills. Tony, over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia, and afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about the legal implications of the Automated and Electrical Vehicles Act. And to begin with a little bit of background. Automated vehicle technologies, in which I would include advanced driver assistance systems. These technologies are developing at a speed with which the lawmakers are struggling to match. The regulators are under pressure to create a framework that both removes barriers to the development, testing and adoption of these vehicle technologies, but which at the same time sets out clear safety standards to which manufacturers should adhere. And it's envisaged that the first mover advantage that's gained by those countries which are quick to put in place clear and robust regulations will reap huge benefits in terms of inward investment. The UK government, for its part, has proposed a step-by-step approach with a rolling programme of regulatory reform. The only immediate change that the government has identified as requiring primary legislation is to update the insurance framework for automated vehicles. And the intention is that this will give insurers and manufacturers time to consider what insurance products can come to market in time for when this sort of technology hits the roads. The Automated and Electrical Vehicles Act received a royal assent on the 19th of July of this year, and it will come into force on whatever day the Secretary of State appoints by way of regulation. And as Matthew indicated, the focus of this webinar is on part 1 of the Act, which deals with automated vehicles. So just let's look at what we mean by automated vehicles. For the purpose of the Act, automated vehicles are defined by a list that has to be prepared and updated by the Secretary of State of all motor vehicles which are deemed to be designed or adapted to be capable in at least some circumstances or situations of safely driving themselves, and which may lawfully be used when driving themselves in at least some circumstances or situations on roads or other public places in Great Britain. And a vehicle is then defined as driving itself if it is operating in a mode in which it is not being controlled and does not need to be controlled by an individual. So the definition of automated vehicles clearly catches vehicles with level 4, which is highly automated, and level 5, which is fully automated levels of automation on the Society of American Engineers, the SAE standard. The position with respect to vehicles with lower levels of automated technology, or those using advanced driver assistance systems, is arguably less clear. However, the Act doesn't define automated vehicles by reference to the SAE standard. And Baroness Sugg, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of the State of Transport, has stressed that the Act applies only to highly and fully automated vehicles.
Can I ask a quick question there, Tony, that's come through, and that is, where is the technology at the moment? Do we have level 4 and level 5 technology out there, or is this really future gazing? Is the technology not at that stage yet?
Well, David can probably answer better than I can, but at the moment, as far as I'm aware, automated vehicles are not on sale yet to the public.
No, I mean, a Tesla, which people think of as an automated vehicle, isn't. It's level 2.5.
Yeah.
The Audi A8, there's a level 3 version that is for sale in 2018. But we won't see level 4 vehicles.
So this is really quite future gazing then, in that sense.
Yeah, but not that far advanced, just
yeah.
a couple of years off. And in terms of level 4 and level 5 technology, not in the general public domain, but there are a number of test vehicles around.
Okay.
Yeah, by November we'll have 40 level 5 pods in Milton Keynes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right, sorry to interrupt, but that seemed an apposite moment to ask that question.
Following an amendment that was proposed by the House of Lords, the Secretary of State is required to prepare a report which is to assess the impact and effectiveness of classifying automated vehicles by way of a maintained list, and also whether the Act is ensuring that appropriate insurance or other arrangements are put in place for automated vehicles. And that report is required to be laid before Parliament no later than 2 years after publication of the first list.
So I've got another question come through, and that is motor insurance a legal requirement for automated vehicles being driven off-road or on private land where the Road Traffic Act does not apply?
Well, the insurance arrangements will apply where the vehicles are driven on roads or other public places. Yeah,
but we have the VINUC complication as well. So currently it's applying exactly where the existing Road Traffic Act applies, and we wouldn't want it to be applying in certain other areas. But as I say, there's other sort of European influences there that might change that. But currently you just need to think of this Act applying in exactly the same circumstances as the Road Traffic Act.
Thank you.
Moving on to compulsory motor insurance, Matthew has already touched on this. The UK law on compulsory motor insurance is intended to ensure that victims of road accidents are compensated quickly and fairly. However, in the case of an automated vehicle which is being operated in automated mode, accidents could take place not as a result of the driver's negligence, but as a result of a defect in the vehicle. And in that case, the remedy, or the only remedy, would be to pursue a product liability claim against the vehicle manufacturer, which we know how complex that could prove. The Act, therefore, as Matthew indicated, extends compulsory motor insurance to cover the use of automated vehicles in automated mode. What that means is the person who suffers damage will be covered by compulsory motor insurance, which is in place on the vehicle. And the Act does this by placing first instance liability on the insurer for an accident caused by an automated vehicle on a road or other public place, if the vehicle is insured. The liability of the insurer will also include liability for any damage suffered by the insured person where the automated vehicle is driving itself. Now, the principles of contributory negligence under English law will still apply to the apportionment of liability in relation to accidents where the insured person is to some extent to blame for the accident or the resulting damage. The Act also permits the insurer to exclude or limit under the policy liability for damage suffered by an insured person, which arises from an accident which is caused as a direct result of a software alteration made to the vehicle's software system, which is prohibited under the policy, or a failure to install safety critical software updates. The Act makes clear that the imposition of this initial liability on the insurer does not in any way affect any other person's liability in respect to the accident. And what the Act does, therefore, is it gives the insurer a statutory right to claim against the person responsible for the accident, be it the vehicle manufacturer or a third party or software supplier. The insurer will have to prove that such person was liable to the insured person or to the injured person under existing common law and product liability laws. There's no presumption of liability, so the product liability risk passes effectively to the insurer, and the insurer must prove the defect in the vehicle. And the time period for any claim by the insurer against another person responsible for the accident is 2 years from the date upon which the insurer settles its liability. I'm just going to say a few words about access to data, which I think David's going to pick up as well. Automated vehicles are inevitably going to generate, collect and process enormous quantities of data. That data is likely to be critical in establishing the cause of an accident and apportionment of liability. For that reason, in some countries, I understand Germany is one of those, legislation requires automated vehicles to be fitted with black boxes to record whether the human driver or the system itself was in control of the vehicle at the relevant time. Our legislation is silent both on vehicle data capture and data access. These issues were noted by a number of industry commentators as the bill made its way through Parliament. It was also raised by the House of Lords. Baroness Sugg indicated that it's expected that black boxes will be regulated at an international level, and it would be against the UK's interest to act unilaterally before decisions have been taken at an international level. I'm going to sort of conclude with a few remarks. The establishment of an insurance framework for automated vehicles is, I think, an important step towards the creation of a regulatory framework in what is a dynamic and fast-moving sector. However, the Act is deliberately narrow in scope and it leaves a number of important issues unresolved. These issues are going to have to be addressed by the government, particularly if it's going to achieve its aim of creating the most advanced regulatory framework for driverless cars in the world. In addition to the new insurance framework, the UK government has identified two new advanced driver assistance systems, which are likely to come to market shortly. One is motorway systems for travel on high-speed roads, such as motorways and major track roads, and the other is remote controlled parking. And in response to these technologies, the government is proposing to amend specific aspects of the current regulatory framework by, in particular, making changes to the construction and use regulations for road vehicles, and also providing guidance in the highway code for drivers about the safe and appropriate use of these new advanced driver assistance systems. The government also announced in March of this year the start of a 3-year review by the Law Commission of England and Wales and the Scottish Law Commission to examine any legal obstacles that there might be to the sort of widespread introduction of self-driving cars and really highlight the need for regulatory reform. And we'll have to see how that review review proceeds.
Okay, Tony, thank you very much. Now, as we segue from you over to David, I've got a question. I'm not sure which one of you would want to pick this up, but it's I've got a question saying, can you touch upon the legal position being introduced within EU countries, such as the Republic of Ireland? Is that something you want to pick up, David, or do you want to?
I think one of the advantages of the fact that we've got the Act there for everybody to read is that hopefully it will influence other territories. We haven't done it to try and upstage anyone. I think one of the reasons we have done it is exactly that we recognise that if we have completely different legal frameworks around the globe, it's going to be a problem for individuals and for motor manufacturers. So we hope that our Act will influence other people. But if you look across Europe, vehicles are insured in quite different ways already. So I think there will be a variation, but hopefully by getting our detail out soon, it will have some influence and we'll see more consistency.
And what's interesting is that the EU level, the EU has been very slow in terms of in terms of progressing the European sort of regulatory framework, and it's been left very much to the national member states.
Okay, thank you. So shall we move on to gathering a bit of understanding about autonomous technology, David?
Yes, certainly. And I mean, that's my first slide really, in terms of, we as insurers have spent years trying to understand the human element, We have huge numbers of actuaries gathering external data on individuals, hobbies, influences, lifestyles. Behavioural analysis is something that we talk about a lot, and all of a sudden that human element is going to be not only less important to how we price and assess risk, eventually you could argue it's going to be of no relevance whatsoever. So it's a massive change in replacing those sort of geographical, employment and behavioural patterns. We now have to start understanding the technology in much greater detail, and that first slide is just trying to show some of the things that are being built into autonomous vehicles. And the functionality is only half the story, because in terms of trying to detect whether something's ahead of you on the road, you can do that with a normal camera, with radar, with LiDAR, with ultrasound. And we as an insurance industry need to get to grips with that and understand the strengths and weaknesses of all those different components, and that's what we're trying to do. I have to be honest and say I'm quite proud of the UK insurance industry's response, because we're not renowned for leading the way, but a couple of years ago we recognised that there was going to be a massive impact on the insurance industry, and therefore individual insurers and the ABI, the Association of British Insurers, started to do things generally. And we formed the Autonomous Driving Insurance Group, ADIG, and I'm pleased to be the chair of that. And it's one of the best attended forums, I think, at the ABI, because everybody recognises that we get a lot of premium in the UK from motor insurance. I think it's about £12 billion annually, and this is going to be massively disrupted. The firms that you see across the top of that slide, including ourselves, the GSRSA, Direct Line, are the ones that I would say are more heavily involved, and I'll come on to that a bit more. But also, we're very fortunate to have Thatcham, the Motor Vehicle Research Institute, which, if you haven't heard of it, is owned by insurers and is probably more known for testing how to repair vehicles, but in terms of trying to understand the impact of this new technology, they've been incredibly useful. So as well as being involved in the ADIG, what ourselves and some other insurers have done is that the government decided they wanted to make funds available for consortia that wanted to further the aim of putting the UK at the forefront of connected autonomous vehicles. And at AXA, we've got a bit carried away, to be honest. We're actually now involved in 5 different consortia, all funded by the government: Venturer, UK Autodrive, Flourish, Capri and RoboPilot. And what they're doing is they're looking at every single aspect of connected autonomous vehicles, from the technology to public acceptance to the impact on society and cyber risks. And the reason we got involved is we recognise we don't have that data that we really rely on. We don't have that history, and therefore by being involved in the consortia, we can get test data that should give us a head start, but also it's a really good way of showing the government that we're serious about supporting what we think is going to be a really, really positive initiative. And RSA are also involved in one consortia as our Direct Line. So it's a good way. I would recommend, as the government continues to roll out funding, that if your firm is interested, see if you can get involved in one of these consortia, because it will bring big benefits. I thought on the next slide I'd mention our involvement in the bill. So as Matthew said at the start, it was originally proposed that, well, it'll be a products liability risk, won't it? And insurers will then just have to try and subrogate on behalf of our customers, and that wouldn't have worked. So we started with the concept of what's best for Joe Public, the man in the street, and certainly, particularly in an environment where you're going to have vehicles that sometimes will be operating autonomously and sometimes will be driven manually, the idea of effectively extending the existing Road Traffic Act, which is there to protect people generally, so that it applied to autonomous vehicles as well, made absolute sense. And so we should feel quite proud that we influence the government in that regard. To turn to the question earlier on about what happened to aviation, well, I think at the start of these discussions, everything was in there. It was modern transport. That's what they were talking about. But I think they realised that there's enough in just the vehicle space. Strangely, in the parliamentary scrutiny sessions in Westminster, there have been a huge number of challenges on the electric vehicle side, whether or not the infrastructure is going to be able to cope in the UK. So effectively, it's just been refining down to keep the bill in act as it now is, focusing on the motor vehicle element. The slide in front of you sort of describes things that we think are really important. We're using this to continue our lobbying, and it does stem from simple things like naming. So the idea of a Tesla describing their driver assistance system as autopilot, we think is likely to confuse the consumer, so we're not keen on that. We want systems to be location specific so they can't be used in inappropriate areas, and we do want there to be safe backup, safe stop, and clear handover to a driver if a vehicle can operate in two different ways. And there's lots to be said about that. But point 10 on that slide leads into the next one, which is all about data. And it states the obvious really, in that claims can't be settled without data. But our early conversations with motor manufacturers weren't very productive. They suggested that the data was theirs and they would use whatever privacy regulations they could to make sure that we never saw any of it. Fortunately, they've moved on considerably, and we're now talking about being able to get accident data, just pure accident data, in a reasonable time. But the compromise that's being proposed by the motor industry representatives currently is that rather than insurers being able to get this direct from the vehicle, it will come via a network of independent hubs, clearing houses. That still has some way to go yet, because I know that the police specifically would like to be able to get data instantly directly from a vehicle. So that has further work to be done. My next slide, though, I wanted to emphasize that this need for data isn't just about dealing with claims. If you think about the fact that we're going to need to be developing new products for our customers going forward, a lot of that could be fed by driving data. Also, if you look at the automotive sector generally, it's not just the OEMs. The rich environment that we have, the economy, the entrepreneurial spirit of the automotive sector is often not driven by the OEMs. It's driven by much smaller firms, and there's a real risk that unless they can get access to data in the same way that they've been able to get access to tools and instruments in the past, that will die. Unfortunately, Insurance Europe has started quite a big campaign on data for drivers, but it's for wider firms as well.
So David, does that driving data though not belong to the driver because it's classed as biometric?
Yeah, I remember very much my first conversation with a large German manufacturer, and I said, they said it's our data. I said, I think you'll find it's the drivers, and they said yes, but we will get them to sign a piece of paper when they buy the vehicle which says we have access to it and you don't. So that was the terrible situation that we were faced with up front. So it is, we all agree, it is consumer data, but we need to, working with GDPR and the government, make sure it's available so that we don't have problems with privacy or undue risks of hacking, but it's available to help us deal with claims and support customers generally. I'll just rapidly go through the last couple of slides because we're running a bit late. The next slide talks about shared mobility and how the number of people miles will change over the next 20 years or so. And what you're really seeing there is that a lot less people will be owning and driving their own vehicles. We will see a lot more car sharing generally, but that in itself is made a lot easier. If you think of car clubs, people tend to be members of car clubs if there's a facility at the end of their road or something like that. As soon as we get the capabilities to be able to summon up a driverless car on your iPad, then suddenly that need to have your own vehicle parked on your drive becomes much less. And the other aspect is the cost of these vehicles, the cost of being transported around is very much influenced by whether or not there needs to be a paid driver. The reason Uber are so anxious to get ahead in terms of autonomous vehicles is because the driver is easily the single biggest cost, and therefore if they can take the driver out, then they can get the cost of using an Uber down to effectively equal to owning and operating a vehicle yourself. So what we're going to see with a combination of increased shared mobility, more autonomous vehicles, safer vehicles, is a massive drop-off of car insurance premiums. And if you look at the orange bars on this slide, you see that by 2040, what we know currently as sort of private motor insurance is going to be a very tiny proportion of what it is today. And that has a massive impact. If you think in the UK, there are a lot of large monoline motor insurers who are really going to have to consider their business case. Yes, there will be some alternative premiums coming in terms of commercial motor for mobility service providers and a degree of product liability. But even there, we believe that roads will be safer and therefore premiums overall will be massively reduced. So you could say that that's a terrible thing, and we should be very concerned about it. But certainly in AXA and with the other members of the ADIG within the ABI, we see the huge number of deaths that happen globally on the roads every year. We're quite well off in terms of fatalities in the UK from road accidents, but still it's the biggest cause of road accidents for young males, and over 1 million people die in road accidents. So our view is, yes, our premiums are going to be massively impacted, but it's a good thing for society, and therefore rather than trying to resist it, we should be involved, we should be influencing it and trying to shape our products for the future.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, all three of our speakers. Of course, you've now figured out that you are now the AMIC dream team on this subject, and it will come as no surprise that we'll keep in touch with you. And as there are developments in this subject, perhaps you'll come back and share those with us, because I think this is a subject that's very much on AMIC's agenda and will stay there. And we're absolutely delighted that we have three such interesting and informed people that are sitting there giving us the benefit of their advice and experience. So thank you very much for being part of this webinar today. We will make this webinar available on the AMIC website. And thank you, members who have dialed in today. We really appreciate you giving your time up for these events, but especially again to our three speakers. So thank you very much indeed. And we look forward to keeping in touch with you. Thank you.